The letter showed up on a Tuesday morning, stuck between a pizza coupon and my electric bill, like it was trying to hide. I almost missed it entirely because I was too busy chipping a solid inch of ice off my front walkway with a flathead shovel, cursing under my breath at the kind of January cold that gets into your bones and just stays there. But I caught the return address, Maplewood Ridge Homeowners Association, and I felt that familiar tightening in my stomach. Nothing good ever comes in a crisp white envelope from those people. Nothing. Ever. My name is Craig Reynolds, and I've lived at 14 Birchwood Lane in the Maplewood Ridge subdivision for going on 11 years now. I bought the place when the neighborhood was new, when the HOA was still just a 2-page document and a handshake promise that it would only ever be used for reasonable community maintenance. I was naive back then. We all were. Because what that document eventually became, once Judy Ellsworth got her claws into the board, was a weaponized bureaucratic nightmare dressed up in a neighborhood newsletter. I stood there on my icy walkway, letter in hand, cold enough that my breath was coming out in thick white clouds, and I read the thing, twice, then a third time because I honestly could not believe what I was reading. Dear Mr. Reynolds, it has been brought to the attention of the Maplewood Ridge Homeowners Association that you are operating a portable wood pellet heating unit on your rear patio space. Per Section 4, Subsection 12B of the Maplewood Ridge Community Standards and Regulations, any supplemental outdoor heating device, including but not limited to portable pellet heaters, propane patio heaters, wood-burning fire pits, and similar appliances, requires formal pre-approval from the HOA board prior to seasonal operation. This approval must be renewed each winter season. Failure to obtain pre-approval may result in a fine of up to $250 per day of non-compliant operation. Please submit Form HOA-47B along with a written description of the unit, its fuel source, its placement dimensions, and a photograph, no later than 15 business days from the date of this letter. Judy Ellsworth, HOA Compliance Officer. I read it again, pre-approved, each winter, for a heater I already owned, a heater sitting on my own private patio, behind my own house. I looked up at the sky. Gray and heavy, like it was thinking about dumping another 6 inches on us before Thursday. The temperature was hovering right around 10 degrees Fahrenheit. My outdoor thermometer, which I could see from the driveway, confirmed it. And Judy Ellsworth wanted me to fill out a form with a photograph and a written description before I was allowed to run my pellet heater on my own back patio. I folded the letter very carefully, tucked it into my jacket pocket, and finished shoveling my walkway. I needed to think. The pellet heater had been part of my life for about 3 winters. I'd bought it after my gas bill during the previous February nearly gave me a heart attack. The thing is brilliant, honestly. It runs on compressed wood pellets, totally clean, very efficient, and it sits out on the back patio where I do most of my winter living. Yes, I know that sounds weird. But I've got a covered patio with a tongue-and-groove pine ceiling, string lights, and a big outdoor sectional couch with weatherproof cushions that I refuse to put away even in winter. It's my sanctuary. On weekend afternoons when it's cold but clear, I fire up the pellet heater and sit out there with a cup of coffee, watching the snow settle on the backyard, and I'm completely at peace. It doesn't bother a single neighbor. It doesn't make noise. The emissions are minimal. It just puts out radiant heat and makes my patio comfortable at temperatures where it otherwise wouldn't be. Nobody had ever complained. Not once. Not my immediate neighbor Dave on the left, not the Garcias on the right, not anybody on the street behind me who might theoretically see it over the fence. This was Judy Ellsworth doing what Judy Ellsworth does, which is patrol the neighborhood with the energy of a board general and the authority of someone who has confused volunteer HOA compliance officer with elected official with a mandate. I'd had run-ins with Judy before, of course. The whole neighborhood had. She was the one who sent Dave a violation notice, because his garage door was a slightly different shade of beige. than what the approved color palette allowed. She was the one who measured Tom Haverson's fence post with an actual tape measure and declared it 2 inches too tall. She'd gotten someone fined for having a welcome mat that was, and I am not making this up, too large in proportion to the front entry space. And every single time, Judy acted like she was doing you a favor by catching it, like you should be grateful, like she was protecting the sanctity of the neighborhood from your rogue welcome mat. The thing that really got me about the pre-approval rule, beyond the sheer absurdity of it, was the each winter part. Not get it approved once and you're good. Not register your device with the HOA and keep a copy on file. No. Every single year before winter, I'd need to fill out Form HOA-47B, provide a photograph, write a description, and wait for board approval. Like the heater was going to change. Like the wood pellets were somehow different in January 2026 than they'd been in January 2025. I went inside, poured myself a coffee, and opened my laptop. First thing I did was pull up the actual HOA CC&Rs. That's the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the founding document of the HOA. I downloaded a copy years ago specifically because I knew this kind of moment would come eventually. I opened it and went straight to Section 4. Section 4 dealt with exterior structures and alterations. Subsection 12 was about outdoor appliances and fixtures. I read through 12A, which was about permanently installed appliances. Then I got to 12B, and here's what 12B actually said. Permanently installed outdoor heating or cooking appliances, including gas lines, electrical connections, and fixed structures, must be approved by the HOA board prior to installation. Permanently installed, fixed structures, gas lines, electrical connections. My pellet heater was none of those things. It had 4 rubber feet and weighed about 45 pounds. I could pick it up and move it to the garage whenever I wanted. It wasn't installed. It wasn't permanent. It didn't involve a gas line or an electrical connection beyond a standard 110-volt plug that went into my outdoor outlet. It was, by any reasonable definition, a portable appliance, like a portable fan, like a space heater you'd use in your living room, except this one happened to be on a patio. The CC&Rs didn't say a single word about portable devices requiring seasonal pre-approval. There was no Form HOA-47B mentioned anywhere in the document. That form and that requirement appeared to be something Judy had invented entirely on her own and dressed up in official-sounding language. I sat back in my chair and sipped my coffee. Outside, it had started snowing again, the fine powdery kind that doesn't stick heavily but drifts into corners and makes everything look like a greeting card. My patio was already getting a dusting on the furniture cushions. I thought about just ignoring the letter, but Judy was not someone you could safely ignore. She would absolutely fine me, and then I'd have to fight the fine, and the whole thing would drag on for months. I needed a smarter approach. I called my neighbor Tom first. Tom Haverson, the fence post guy. He dealt with Judy more than anyone and had become something of an informal expert on her methods. She do the Form HOA-47B thing on you too. Tom said before I'd even finished explaining. He was eating something crunchy on his other end of the phone, and I could hear his own snow blower running in the background, presumably on his driveway. "You got one of these letters?" I asked. "Mine was about my propane patio heater, last October. She sent it right before the first freeze, very deliberate timing. I looked it up, Craig. That form doesn't exist in any official HOA document. She made it up." "That's what I figured." "Did you fill it out?" "No. I told her I'd reviewed the CC&Rs and my propane heater didn't require HOA approval because it wasn't a permanent installation." She came back at me with a letter citing general community aesthetics as a justification. I told her community aesthetics wasn't a specific enforceable standard and asked her to cite the exact rule number. She never wrote back. I love Tom. He's exactly the kind of neighbor you want when you live in an HOA neighborhood. "She's been doing it to a bunch of people," Tom continued. Dave got one about his outdoor string lights. The Garcias got one about their little chimney. She's trying to turn every single outdoor heating device in the neighborhood into an annual fee-generating approval process. That word fee landed in my head like a stone into still water. I hadn't even gotten to the fee part yet. I went back to Judy's letter and reread it. The fine was $250 per day of noncompliance, but there was nothing in the letter about what the approval process itself cost. I hadn't noticed that the first time. I called Tom back. "Tom, did your Form HOA-47B have a filing fee?" A pause, the sound of something being put down. I didn't fill it out. But she verbally mentioned a $25 processing fee when she came to my door. A $25 fee, per application, per year, in a neighborhood with about 300 homes. If even a tenth of those homes had some kind of outdoor heater or heating appliance, and she managed to get everyone to comply, that was $750 a year, minimum. Probably more. And where exactly would that money go? The HOA budget was technically public to members, but in practice Judy and the two other board members who did whatever she said controlled the books, and the budget reports were vague to the point of uselessness. This was starting to look less like Judy being controlling and more like Judy running a low-grade scheme. The weather had dropped another 2 degrees by the time I looked at the thermometer again. I was going to need that heater on the patio this weekend. I had no intention of not using it. I decided to document everything from the start. I went to my patio, cleared the snow off the heater and the surrounding area, and took a full video walkthrough showing the heater, its placement, its power cable going to the wall outlet, its 4 rubber feet, the total lack of any permanent installation, and its clear position entirely within my private patio space. Nowhere near property lines, nowhere visible from the street. I narrated as I walked, stating the date, the time, and the temperature, which was now sitting at 9 degrees Fahrenheit. Then I went back inside and drafted a formal response letter to Judy. I kept it polite, because you always want to start polite. I stated that I had reviewed Section 4, Subsection 12B of the Maplewood Ridge CC&Rs, and that the provision applied exclusively to permanently installed appliances requiring fixed connections to gas or electrical infrastructure. I noted that my portable wood pellet heater required no permanent installation and no dedicated gas or electrical connection beyond a standard 110-volt outlet, and therefore did not fall under the scope of 12B as written. I requested, in writing, the specific CC&R citation that required portable appliances to undergo annual pre-approval, and I asked her to provide a copy of the official board resolution that had created Form HOA-47B. I sent it certified mail and kept a copy for myself. That should have been the end of it. A reasonable person would have read my letter, recognized that I had done my homework, and quietly dropped it. Judy Ellsworth was not a reasonable person. 3 days later, 3 days that were bitterly cold, with temperatures hovering between 5 and 15 degrees and a fresh 4 inches of snow that had made the roads in our subdivision genuinely treacherous. I came home from work to find a formal notice of violation taped to my front door. Not mailed, taped, with packing tape. The violation notice stated that I had failed to submit Form HOA-47B within the required timeline, and that I was in violation of HOA Community Standards Regulation 12B and associated board directives. The fine was $250 for the first day and would accrue at $250 per day going forward until the application was submitted and approved. There was a wet boot print on the bottom of the notice from where it had been stepped on after it was placed, which told me Judy had personally come to my door in the cold and the snow to tape this thing up herself. I stood on my front step holding the violation notice in the dark. It was already past 5 and fully dark because January is merciless that way, and I looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked at the security camera mounted above my front door, one of 3 I'd installed about 2 years ago after a porch pirate hit 2 houses on my street in the same week. I checked the timestamp later that night. Judy had come to my door at 3:47 in the afternoon while I was at work. She'd rung the doorbell, which the camera caught. Then she taped the notice up and left. The footage was crisp, perfectly clear, and it captured something interesting that the still image from a quick glance might have missed. When Judy reached into her bag to pull out the tape and the violation notice, something else came out briefly and she tucked it back quickly, a small notepad. I zoomed in during playback. I couldn't read the writing, but the notepad appeared to have a list of addresses on it. A route. She was systematically going door to door. I started making calls. By 8 that night, I'd talked to 6 neighbors. Tom already knew about his. Dave had gotten one. The Garcias had gotten one. Mark Kowalski, 3 streets over, had gotten one about a portable propane heater he'd bought at Costco. Linda Nguyen had gotten one about a small electric patio heater she had on her covered front porch. Janet from the cul-de-sac had gotten one about a fire pit she'd used exactly twice in November. 7 of us, that I knew of personally, all with the same Form HOA-47B letter, all threatening the same $250 per day fine. All for portable, non-permanent outdoor heating devices. And all delivered within the same 2-week window in mid-January, right at the coldest stretch of the season, when people were most likely to be using their heaters, and therefore most likely to simply pay the $25 fee and comply rather than fight it in the cold. The timing wasn't coincidental. Judy had chosen the coldest stretch of winter deliberately, so the inconvenience and the cold would wear people down into compliance faster. I went to bed that night genuinely annoyed, but also genuinely energized. Because here's the thing about Judy, and I'd figured this out through years of living in this neighborhood, she was a bully, and bullies count on people being too tired or too intimidated to fight back. The moment you actually push back with evidence and documentation, they tend to crack, because they haven't actually built anything solid. They've built a house of cards that looks imposing until you blow on it. The next morning, I called a real estate attorney I knew named Gary, who handled HOA disputes among other things. I explained the situation. He asked me to send him the HOA's CC&Rs, Judy's original letter, my response, and the violation notice. I did that before noon. Gary called me back that afternoon while I was eating lunch and watching the snow plow make its third pass through my subdivision without actually clearing the side streets, because of course it hadn't. The main entrance road was perfectly clear and the cul-de-sacs were packed ice. "Okay," Gary said, "here's the deal. The CC&Rs are clear. Subsection 12B applies to permanent installations. Your device doesn't meet that definition." Her violation notice cites associated board directives as additional authority, which means she's claiming the board passed some kind of resolution that extends 12B's scope to include portable devices. That resolution would need to be documented, voted on, and disclosed to homeowners in advance. Do you have any record of ever receiving notification of such a resolution? I thought about it. The HOA sent out a monthly newsletter, or was supposed to, though it often came late or not at all. I had a folder on my computer where I'd saved every newsletter I'd ever received. I went through them that evening. Nothing. No board resolution about portable heaters. No notification of expanded pre-approval requirements. No mention of Form HOA-47B. Gary had suggested I submit a formal written request for all HOA board meeting minutes from the last 2 years, along with any resolutions or rule amendments related to outdoor heating appliances. Under our state's HOA law, the board was required to provide this documentation to homeowners upon written request within a reasonable time frame. I submitted the request the next morning, certified mail, to the HOA's registered address as well as to Judy's home address as the listed compliance officer. While I waited for a response, the situation in the neighborhood had started to develop its own momentum. Tom had told Mark, and Mark had told Linda, and Linda was friends with half the cul-de-sac. And by the end of that first week, there were 14 homeowners who had received the Form HOA-47B letter. 14. And a few of them had already paid the $25 processing fee and submitted the form, not because they thought it was legitimate, but because they were busy. It was freezing, and $25 felt easier than a fight, which was exactly what Judy was counting on. We set up a group text chain. It started as a practical information-sharing thing. Who got letters? What were the dates? What devices were involved? But within a couple of days, it had turned into a genuine mutual aid operation. Tom had made a spreadsheet. Linda had started drafting a collective response letter. Dave had found a provision in our state's HOA statutes about the limits of HOA enforcement authority. Mark, who worked in finance, had offered to formally request a complete financial accounting of HOA funds collected via processing fees and fines over the last 3 years. The weather was not letting up. We got another 6 inches of snow on Saturday, followed by freezing rain Sunday morning that turned the whole subdivision into a skating rink. I spent 2 hours that Sunday clearing my driveway and walkway, then went around to help Mrs. Patterson next door, who couldn't do it herself. Half the street was out doing the same for each other. That's the thing about real neighborhood community. It shows up in the cold, when it actually costs you something. Judy's version of community standards had nothing to do with any of that. It was about paperwork and fees and compliance. Monday brought something I hadn't expected. I got home from work to find a woman I didn't recognize standing on the sidewalk in front of my house, looking at my front door. She was older, maybe early 60s, wearing a very nice parka. She introduced herself as Sheila Fromm. She lived 2 streets over, and she wasn't one of the 14 who'd gotten letters, not yet. But she'd heard about what was happening through Linda, and she wanted to talk. Sheila told me that she was the HOA board treasurer from 3 years ago, before Judy had effectively pushed the existing board members out one by one and replaced them with people who did whatever she said. Sheila had documentation from her time on the board that showed the board meeting minutes for the past 4 years. She'd kept copies, which she was legally entitled to do as a former board member. She pulled a folder out of her bag. I stood in the cold on my driveway reading through it with her. There was no resolution about portable heaters. There was no vote creating Form HOA-47B. There was no official expansion of subsection 12B's scope. What there was, in the most recent year's minutes, the only year for which Judy's people had been keeping the records, was a line item in the budget labeled Administrative Processing Revenue, with a target amount that seemed wildly optimistic. Someone had budgeted for that revenue. Someone had planned to generate it. And there was something else. Sheila pointed it out quietly. In the financial statements from the current year, there was a line item for HOA general fund transfers that were substantially larger than in previous years. Money was moving from processing fees and fines into the general fund, and from the general fund into a vaguely described line item called Management and Administrative Services. There was no vendor listed. There was no contract attached. Do you know who or what Management and Administrative Services refers to? I asked her. Sheila shook her head. I tried to ask once at a board meeting. Judy said it was for outsourced administrative support. When I asked for the vendor's name and the contract, she said it would be provided at the next meeting. It never was. I stopped coming to meetings after that because Judy made them actively hostile to anyone who asked questions. I stood there in the freezing January evening, my breath clouding in front of my face, holding copies of HOA financial records that strongly suggested something considerably worse than bureaucratic overreach. The $25 processing fees and the $250 per day fines weren't just Judy being controlling. If what Sheila's documents suggested was accurate, they were generating revenue that was disappearing into an undocumented vendor line item. That was a potential financial crime. Misappropriation of HOA funds at minimum. I thanked Sheila and told her I needed to make some calls. She pressed the copied documents into my hands and said, "I've been waiting 3 years for someone to actually do something about this. Please don't let her win again." I called Gary that night. I laid out everything: the lack of any valid board resolution creating the approval requirement, the 14 homeowners who'd received letters, the 7 who'd paid fees, the financial irregularities in the HOA budget, and the undocumented management and administrative services line item. Gary was quiet for a moment and then said, "Craig, if what you're describing is accurate, this isn't just an HOA dispute. This is potential fraud. Specifically, if board members are directing HOA funds to a vendor that is themselves or a related party and not disclosing it, that's self-dealing and it may constitute theft or embezzlement under your state statutes." He told me what to do next. Get an attorney to send a formal letter to the entire HOA board demanding a complete financial audit and disclosure of all vendor relationships. Simultaneously, if I believe there was active fraud, report it to the state's Attorney General, which had an HOA enforcement division in our state, and to local law enforcement. I spent the next morning building the file. I had Judy's original letter with the false citation, the violation notice, my response letter, her non-response to my request for documentation, the group text records showing 14 homeowners who'd received similar letters, the 7 confirmed payments from homeowners who'd paid the $25 fee, the HOA financial documents Sheila had provided, and my own saved newsletters showing no disclosure of any rule change or board resolution regarding portable heaters. I also went back to my security camera footage from the week before and compiled a clip reel of Judy's visit to my door. And in checking the cameras, I found something extra. My side-facing camera, which covered my driveway and the side of the house, had caught Judy walking down my street with that notepad, stopping at houses, photographing porches and patios with her phone. She wasn't just responding to complaints. She was proactively hunting for violations, photographing people's private patios from the street or their driveways to document what appliances they had. Now, in a public-facing area that might be legally permissible. But she was in some cases clearly stepping onto private driveways to get a better angle at a back patio, which is trespassing. Gary sent the formal legal letter to the HOA board via certified mail and email on a Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, I had forwarded our complete documentation package to the State Attorney General's HOA Enforcement Division, and a handful of the other 14 homeowners had submitted their own supporting complaints. Mark had submitted a formal request for a financial audit under state HOA statutes, which required the board to respond within 30 days. Thursday, the snow came back. 8 inches this time, which buried the street properly, turned the sidewalks invisible, and made the morning commute in our subdivision a genuine ordeal, because the plow service the HOA contracted hadn't showed up. People were stuck. Literally stuck cars spinning on the incline at the end of my street, people in boots pushing neighbors' cars, the whole neighborhood and winter experience in full effect. And where was Judy? I found out later that she was at her house, nice and warm, because she happened to have a snow removal service contracted privately for her own driveway and walkway. While the rest of the neighborhood dug out with shovels and ice scrapers, Judy's driveway was cleared by 8 a.m. The irony of it was not lost on anyone in the group text. I made sure my patio heater was running that Thursday evening. I had people over: Tom, Linda, Dave, Mark, a couple of the others who'd gotten letters. We sat on my patio under the covered ceiling with the string lights on and the pellet heater glowing warmly, snow piled up around the edges of the patio, cold, clear sky above us, and we compared notes and made plans. My patio heater, the one that required pre-approval each winter according to Judy, was doing exactly what it was built to do. Nobody was harmed. No community aesthetic was violated. The neighborhood was perfectly fine. Mark had done some digging of his own. Using public records available through the state's business registry, he'd looked up entities associated with Judy Ellsworth's name and found something. About 18 months ago, right around the time the HOA financial records started showing the management and administrative services line item, a sole proprietorship had been registered under the name Ellsworth Administrative Solutions. The registered owner was listed as Judith M. Ellsworth. The business address was Judy's home address. Ellsworth Administrative Solutions was, apparently, the undisclosed vendor providing management and administrative services to the Maplewood Ridge HOA. Judy Ellsworth was paying herself through her own HOA, using funds generated by fees and fines she'd invented from rules that didn't exist. We sat there in the warmth of my pellet heater and just stared at each other. "That's embezzlement," Tom said flatly. "It's at least self-dealing," Mark said. "Board members aren't allowed to contract with the HOA without full disclosure and member approval. She never disclosed it, she never got approval, she just started paying herself." "How much?" Linda asked. "Based on the line items over 18 months, Mark looked at his phone. "Best estimate, around $14,000. The patio was quiet for a moment except for the soft crackle of the pellet heater and the faint sound of someone down the street running a snow blower. $14,000, Dave said. "And she's out here measuring fence posts and hassling people about welcome mats. And making us get pre-approved to run our own heaters," I said. I called Gary on Friday morning and told him about Ellsworth Administrative Solutions. He was quiet for a few seconds and then said, "Craig, that's criminal. If she created a business, contracted it to the HOA without disclosure, and has been directing HOA funds to herself over 18 months, that's embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty. You need to file a police report. I'll handle the civil side. We can seek recovery of the funds and removal from the board, but the criminal aspect needs to go to police." That afternoon, a group of us, me, Tom, Sheila, Mark, and Linda, went to the local police department. We brought the documentation file, which by this point was substantial, the complete letter correspondence, the financial records, the business registry printout showing Ellsworth Administrative Solutions, the HOA budget documents with the undisclosed vendor line item, the timeline showing when the business was created versus when the line item appeared in the HOA budget. The list of 14 homeowners who'd received Form HOA-47B letters with no legitimate rule backing them. The amounts paid in fees by homeowners. The desk officer at the station had that particular expression that cops get when civilians come in with a pile of documents, a sort of polite wariness, like he wasn't sure if this was going to be a real crime report or someone upset about a parking dispute. But he took our information and called a detective, and the detective was not bored. The detective looked at the business registry document and the HOA financial records side by side, and her expression changed in a way that was quietly satisfying. She took everything we had and told us she'd be in touch. The weekend brought another cold snap. I mean serious cold, -4 on Saturday morning, the kind of cold where your car takes 3 minutes to warm up and the plastic bag you use to clean up after your dog feels like it might shatter. I was out early clearing ice off my walkway again, and so were half my neighbors, and there was that familiar sense of a neighborhood in winter that pulls people together whether they like it or not. You're all fighting the same thing. The cold doesn't care about HOA politics. I got a call from Gary mid-morning Saturday. He'd gotten a response to the legal letter not from Judy, but from one of the other board members, a guy named Phil, who had apparently been acting on Judy's direction for the past couple of years, but who had, Gary suspected, suddenly become very interested in the concept of personal legal liability. Phil's response, drafted by an attorney he'd apparently hired overnight, stated that the board wished to clarify that Form HOA-47B had been introduced by the compliance officer as an administrative convenience, and that it had not been formally voted on and approved by the full board as required for rule changes under the CC&Rs. Phil was, in other words, throwing Judy under the bus so fast it made my head spin. Phil's attorney letter also stated that all violation notices related to Form HOA-47B were hereby rescinded, and all processing fees collected in relation to the form would be refunded within 30 days. The rescission and refund were good, but they didn't address the Ellsworth administrative solutions situation. That became the focus of the following week. The police detective, her name was Rivera, contacted me Monday to let me know that the investigation was moving forward and that she'd been in contact with the state attorney general's HOA enforcement division, whose complaint file was apparently growing with each day. She couldn't share specifics, but she told me to expect some developments. The developments came Thursday. I was at work when my phone buzzed with a text from Tom, which read only, "Look outside your front window." I was not at home. I was in an office building downtown. I replied that I wasn't home and asked what was happening. Tom said, "Police car parked in front of Judy's house. 2 officers. They were inside for about 30 minutes and they just left. She came out and stood in her driveway looking like she'd seen a ghost." I drove home at my normal time. Everything looked quiet on the street. Judy's house showed no unusual activity, but the neighborhood group text was buzzing because Tom wasn't the only one who'd seen the police car. The official news came through channels over the next week. Gary got the civil side moving a lawsuit filed on behalf of the HOA itself, against Judy as an individual, for breach of fiduciary duty and self-dealing, seeking recovery of the $14,000 in improperly redirected funds, plus legal fees. The police investigation had resulted in a formal recommendation to the district attorney's office for charges of misappropriation of funds, which under our state statute covered the conduct of a person in a position of trust like a nonprofit or homeowners association officer, who diverts funds for personal benefit. The charges were eventually filed. Judy Ellsworth was charged with 1 count of misappropriation of funds and 1 count of breach of fiduciary duty. She was arraigned on a Tuesday in February. She didn't go to jail that day. These things take time through the court system, but she was out on her own recognizance with conditions. And the conditions included that she resign from any position with the Maplewood Ridge HOA. She was off the board by that Friday. The 2 board members who'd been going along with her, Phil, and a woman named Renata, both resigned voluntarily the same week. Phil's attorney letter had already established that he was trying to distance himself from the HOA-47B scheme, and both he and Renata were individually named in the civil suit as parties who had allowed Judy's self-dealing without raising objections, which under the CC&Rs exposed them to personal liability. The HOA, for the first time in several years, had no board. That meant an emergency election was required under the CC&Rs within 60 days, and the neighborhood mobilized for it like I hadn't seen since the place was new. Sheila agreed to run again. Tom agreed to run. Linda agreed to run. And over a surprisingly enthusiastic homeowners meeting held in the community center, the first one in years that wasn't a tense slog managed by Judy's parliamentary gavel, they were elected to a new board along with 2 other homeowners. The meeting itself was held on a cold, clear February evening with a foot of snow on the ground and the parking lot iced over, and yet something like 90 homeowners showed up. 90. Out of 300 households, which is an extraordinary turnout for a suburban HOA meeting. People were wearing boots and parkas, and their breath was fogging under the fluorescent lights of the community center, and there was this almost palpable sense of people reclaiming something they'd let slide away. Sheila gave a brief speech that got more applause than you'd expect for an HOA board election speech. She talked about what an HOA was actually supposed to be, a tool for maintaining the community, not for generating revenue through manufactured violations, and certainly not for enriching individual officers. She said the next board would publish clear meeting minutes, transparent budgets, and would make every single rule change subject to proper process and homeowner notification. Tom, when he was introduced, got a loud cheer from the back row that I'm pretty sure was mostly Dave. The new board's first order of business was to formally rescind Form HOA-47B and any associated rule that had been invented without proper process. They also voted to review the entire CC&Rs to identify any provisions that had been added or modified without proper board votes. The review took about 3 weeks and found 4 additional quasi-rules that Judy had invented and enforced without ever formally adopting them through the CC&R amendment process. All of them were rescinded. The refunds went out within 30 days as promised, $25 back to each of the 7 homeowners who'd paid the Form HOA-47B processing fee. Which I know, $25 is not a lot of money, but the principle of the thing mattered. You don't get to invent a rule, scare people into complying, collect fees, and then just keep the money when you get caught. The refunds came with a formal letter of apology from the new HOA board, which was a nice touch that Sheila insisted on. The civil lawsuit against Judy settled several months later. The terms were confidential, but Gary confirmed that the settlement included repayment of a significant portion of the misappropriated funds. The HOA used the recovered money to repave the community center parking lot, which had been deteriorating for 2 years, and which Judy's board had consistently declined to budget for, apparently because fixing the parking lot wouldn't generate any revenue for Ellsworth Administrative Solutions. The criminal case moved slower, as criminal cases always do, but it moved. Last I heard from Gary, the DA was proceeding with the misappropriation charge, and Judy had entered a not guilty plea. Whether she'd eventually take a plea deal or go to trial was still uncertain. That part of the story wasn't over, but the part that mattered to the neighborhood was. Judy Ellsworth was gone from the board. Her manufactured rules were gone. Her self-dealing company was dissolved. Ellsworth Administrative Solutions disappeared from the state business registry about 2 months after the charges were filed. The homeowners had their money back and an accountable board in place. And the HOA newsletter, when it arrived for the first time under new management, was actually readable and informative, and included a full summary of the board meeting minutes, which had never happened before. I celebrated the way I always celebrate things I care about on my back patio, in the cold, with the pellet heater running. It was a Saturday afternoon in mid-February, one of those winter days that's genuinely beautiful if you're dressed for it and you've got a good heat source. The sky was a deep clear blue, the backyard snow was pristine and untouched, and the heater was putting out that steady radiant warmth that makes you feel like you could stay out there forever. Tom came over with his wife. The Garcias stopped by. Dave appeared at my gate at some point holding a 6-pack. Linda showed up with a thermos of hot chocolate big enough to supply a small army. Even Sheila, who I'd mostly only known for a few months, came by and sat in one of the patio chairs with her hands wrapped around a mug and talked about the neighborhood she'd bought into when it was new and the neighborhood she hoped it could be again. No Form HOA-47B, no pre-approval required. No violation notices. No $250 per day fines for the crime of staying warm on my own patio. Just neighbors. In winter. Which is exactly what a neighborhood is supposed to be. There's a postscript to all of this that still makes me smile every time I think about it. About 3 weeks after the new board took over, the HOA newsletter, the first one published under Sheila's watch, included a full list of all appliances and devices that did not require HOA approval based on a plain reading of the CC&Rs. Portable heaters were specifically mentioned, portable fire pits, patio furniture, string lights, potted plants. The kind of exhaustive clarity that comes from a board that actually wants residents to know their rights, rather than be confused about them. At the bottom of the list in small print was a note. The HOA encourages homeowners to enjoy their outdoor spaces year-round. Happy winter, Maplewood Ridge. I cut that out of the newsletter and stuck it on my refrigerator, right next to a photo I'd taken from the patio that Saturday afternoon. Tom and Dave and the Garcias and Linda and Sheila all crowded around the glowing pellet heater with the snow-covered backyard behind them, laughing at something someone had just said, breath fogging in the cold. Judy Ellsworth wanted to make my patio heater a battleground. She wanted paperwork and fees and compliance and control. What she got instead was the neighborhood figuring out that they had rights and the tools to defend them, and enough people willing to stand up together that her whole carefully constructed little empire came down in about 6 weeks. The pellet heater is still out there. It doesn't need pre-approval. It never did. And when the cold comes again next winter, which it will, because January in the Midwest is exactly as merciless as it sounds, I'll fire it up on a Saturday afternoon and sit out there with a cup of coffee and watch the snow settle on the backyard, same as I always have. Maybe Tom will come over. Maybe the Garcias. Maybe Sheila will stop by with her thermos. Maybe all of them. No forms required. There is something deeply satisfying about defeating bureaucratic nonsense with nothing but documentation and patience and neighbors who give a damn. No explosions, no dramatic confrontations, no screaming matches in the driveway. Just evidence, organized carefully, presented to the right people at the right time. Judy's house of cards didn't fall because we kicked it. It fell because we stopped propping it up with our compliance and actually looked at what it was made of. The criminal case eventually resolved about 8 months after everything started, in a plea agreement. Judy pled guilty to a reduced charge of breach of fiduciary duty in a nonprofit organization, a misdemeanor under our state statutes, and was sentenced to 2 years of probation, ordered to complete the full repayment that had already begun under the civil settlement, and was permanently barred from serving on any HOA board in the state for a period of 10 years. The judge, in sentencing, reportedly noted that the breach of trust involved was particularly egregious because the defendant had exploited her position in a residential community, manufacturing false rules to intimidate neighbors and generate undisclosed personal income. I know this because Sheila was in the courtroom and texted me the moment the sentence was read. The text was just one word: done. I was on my patio when I got it. February had mellowed slightly by that point, maybe 22 degrees with the sun actually out for a change, one of those winter days that reminds you spring is coming even if it's taking its time. The pellet heater was running. The backyard was quiet. My coffee was hot. I texted back, good. And then I sat there in the warmth and watched the light change over the snow and felt about as content as a man can feel on a cold February afternoon. The neighborhood moved forward. The roads got plowed more reliably once the new board renegotiated the plow contract, which Judy had apparently kept with an underperforming vendor for reasons the new board couldn't document but had strong suspicions about. The community center parking lot got fixed. The HOA meeting started drawing real attendance because people actually trusted that they'd be listened to. The Form HOA-47B file, whatever documents Judy had generated under that pretend rule, was never found in any official HOA records because it had never been official. It existed only in Judy's filing system, which was presumably somewhere in her house, which was, last I checked, still on the market. She'd put it up for sale a few months after the charges were filed and had reportedly moved in with her sister in another town while she worked through the legal process. Birchwood Lane felt lighter without her. That might sound dramatic, but there's a real psychological weight to living under arbitrary surveillance, never knowing what innocuous thing about your property is going to generate a violation notice this month. When that weight lifts, you notice. The neighbors who'd been careful and quiet and slightly afraid of putting a foot wrong started coming outside more. Dave set up a full outdoor dining situation on his driveway one Saturday in March, just to celebrate the fact that he could. The Garcias got a new chimenea for the back patio and fired it up that same weekend without so much as an email to the HOA. Nobody said a word. Nobody needed to. Mark, who'd been instrumental in tracking down the Ellsworth Administrative Solutions registration, had gotten genuinely interested in HOA law through the whole process and had enrolled in a couple of community education courses about homeowner rights. He became the unofficial neighborhood resource for anyone who had questions about what the HOA actually could and couldn't do, and in a neighborhood of 300 homes that turned out to be a very useful thing to have. Linda organized a late winter neighborhood gathering at the community center, not an official HOA event, just neighbors getting together. That was packed. She called it a spring thaw party, even though it happened in late February when there was still plenty of snow on the ground, because the thaw she meant wasn't meteorological. Sheila brought her good coffee. Tom brought his famous chili. I brought a case of beer and a genuine sense of gratitude for how things had turned out. We stood in the community center with its newly functional parking lot outside and its long folding tables covered in potluck food, and it felt like the neighborhood I'd bought into 11 years ago, when the HOA was still just a 2-page document and a handshake promise. It felt like a community. It had taken a pellet heater and a Form HOA-47B letter and a compliance officer who'd gotten very greedy and overconfident to get us here, but here we were, warm, together. Not particularly interested in being managed or surveilled or charged processing fees for the privilege of sitting on our own patios in winter. I drove home from that party on roads that were finally properly salted and plowed, pulled into my freshly shoveled driveway, walked through my cleared front path, and went straight through the house to the back door. I stepped out onto the patio, cold air hitting me immediately, breath clouding, the backyard dark and quiet with a few inches of fresh snow from the day before. I hit the button on the pellet heater, waited for the ignition sequence and watched the warmth build, sat down in my patio chair, looked up at the winter sky. No approval required, no form to file, no fee to pay, just a man on his own patio, in January, in the neighborhood he chose, living his life. That's really all any of us wanted.